as Ife very kindly said, I will be introducing fisheries governance today and international legal frameworks. Obviously, it's a very big topic, so I'm just going to attempt to give a broad overview of the subject, and hopefully that'll set up the regional outlook and national outlook later in the day. All right, but before we start getting into the components of a fisheries governance system, who's involved, I think it's really important to think about what we are trying to achieve when we are thinking of fisheries governance and fisheries management. What are our objectives? What are our primary objectives when we are working within a fisheries governance system? Does anyone want to volunteer? What would you be thinking of when you're thinking of fisheries management? What are you trying to achieve? Yes.
I think you're trying to achieve orderliness.
Orderliness?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Anyone else? Yeah. Yes?
Sustainable exploitation of the fisheries resources.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm going to actually start bringing these up. Maybe we want healthy fish stocks, like you say. Very important, of course. Yes, I saw a hand. Yeah.
C'est pour la préservation des ressources pour les générations futures.
Sorry. Sustainability? Yes, good.
Je répète ou bien c'est bon?
Thank you, yeah. Sustainability, extremely important. But what elements of sustainability are we talking about? Sustainability is a big concept, right? So, we always think about sustainability as involving environmental elements, social elements, economic elements. So which specific elements are we thinking about? We've heard about fish stocks. What about ecosystems? Are we interested in healthy ecosystems? Maybe we're looking more broadly than the fish stock, right? Maybe it's about the interactions between fish stocks. Maybe it's about how, fishing affects habitats. That could also be a consideration, right? What about the social side of things? What do we want to achieve? Anyone have any ideas? Or what about the economic side of things? Maybe we want money, right? We want to get money from our fish stocks, and that's fine, They are a lucrative resource. Do we want more employment? Yeah? If you think of your own fisheries governance systems, your own fisheries management systems, are you thinking that maybe you want to increase employment in your country? Maybe you want to increase food security? Yeah? That's another important aspect, or retain food security, we should say. And livelihood security for your fishermen. What about safe and healthy fishes? Do we want that? Do we want our fishes to be healthy at sea? Maybe we want to retain cultural practices. Maybe, fishing has to be done in a certain way for generations, and we want to retain that. Maybe we want to prevent poverty. We also know that a lot of the time, fisheries is a poverty prevention mechanism. If we have droughts, for example, if we have wars, if we have famines, the sea is always there for all our people, right? What about this one? Is this potentially a goal of our fisheries governance? We want independence from foreign interests. We know in West Africa, of course, we have a lot of agreements with foreign fishing fleets, right, to come and fish in the waters here. But, maybe the goal of our fishery system is actually to have independence. Maybe we actually want to, be able to fish our own waters and get all the benefits from that. That could also be a goal of our governance system. Anything else? Anything else that anyone can think of that might be integral to their particular fisheries governance system in their country? No? Have I covered everything? So, in an ideal world, obviously, we want to get a balance between all these different elements of sustainability, right? We want a healthy environment, good social outcomes. Potentially on the economic side, we want to earn money. So ideally, we want a balance, right? But In practice, what often happens is that one of these interests rises to the top. One of these interests becomes more important than the others when we are creating our fisheries governance and fisheries management. Does anyone want to volunteer if you think about your own fisheries governance systems, your own fisheries management, your country? Can you think of what is prioritized in that system? Of all of these interests, do you think that one is prioritized above another? Yeah.
Just before we move on to that, there's something that may probably fit in this context within the West African, region. That's migration. Recently we've been experiencing a lot of illegal migration, and fisheries plays a part in this. So maybe to prevent illegal migration may also be one of the objectives.
Illegal migration, yeah, absolutely. Very, very, very relevant topic as well. Yeah. But yeah, do you think that your fishery systems prioritize one of these interests over another? Not to say that you ignore the others, but perhaps one of them is seen as more important than others. And this is not unusual, right? A lot of countries do this. They adopt certain types of fisheries governance, potentially for different fisheries, small scale, industrial, whatever, that prioritizes one of these issues above another. So for example, we have profit-driven models of governance, right? These are often adopted for industrial fisheries. So things like neoliberalism, right? These neoliberalist models where we assess the stocks, we think, we can fish a certain amount without the stock collapsing, and so we create quotas. And we provide quotas to different fishers and different fishing companies. And the purpose of this is firstly to make profit. And what that means in practice is that there's only a certain number of fishers in the system that are actually able to participate, because you have to have a certain level of quota to make a profit. And the rationale for this is that we increase the ownership of resources. And this is a direct response to this idea of the tragedy of the commons. Does everybody know what the tragedy of the commons is? Does everyone understand this concept? Yeah, everyone knows this idea that, if you have common resources, people will go and exploit them. They won't worry about depleting them because they don't own them. So, this is a very simplistic idea, which obviously in practice is not necessarily borne out. We obviously see very different approaches when we think about community management, right? But this is the rationale for this type of neoliberalist approach. And this type of approach, like I said, is often used for industrial fisheries. It doesn't work very well for small-scale fisheries, because often in small-scale fisheries, we're not trying to increase the profit. We are trying to, increase food security, protect livelihoods, and so on. And even though the rationale is to actually promote better environmental stewardship, in practice, this type of approach can, as soon as you put a profit on something, you can have detrimental effects such as dumping, perhaps dumping bycatch, dumping juveniles, underreporting so you can catch more, things like that. So that's a kind of neoliberalist approach. Yeah, I can't get the... No, I was just trying to get the pointer to work, it's fine. All right, then other profit-driven models, one of the main ones is resource nationalism. This idea, and this has been adopted by some sort of, I suppose, larger developing countries like Indonesia, this idea that we are going to develop our own fisheries, right? We are going to invest a lot in the fisheries industry. We are going to fish our own stocks. We are going to reduce dependence on foreign interests, and we are going to create employment and, food security and those sorts of things for our own people. So this is another profit-driven model, but obviously this has then social benefits. Again, the drawback of this is that, if you prioritize profit and development in the short term and not conservation, sometimes you have problems in the long term. So in all of these systems, you can see that even though profit is driving a lot of what is happening here, we also see these other elements, right? We see that there's social benefits, for example, in resource nationalism. We see that there are, technically environmental benefits in neoliberalism. So, this is not an all or nothing approach, but this is the type of approach that prioritizes profit. Then we have socially driven models of governance. So this, again, is going to be used a lot more for the small scale sector, such as customary institutions. This is the situation where local fishing communities might have been managing a particular stock for many years, many decades, through customary rules and practices. And this is kind of just government sort of recognizing these systems in order to, produce social benefits, reduce management burdens, because, when it comes to the small scale sector, it's very difficult to manage from the top down. And this can work well, and it has worked well in some systems, but of course, the problem comes when you start seeing things like population growth or economic modernization. You may have managed the fisheries one way for many, many years, but now the fishers are putting engines on their boats. Maybe they are increasing the size of the boats, and the sector is becoming more and more modern, and so those principles that have worked for many years might become outdated. So when that happens, sometimes these systems fall apart, but they can be very useful, and they have been very useful in some countries in the world for managing fisheries, particularly small-scale community fisheries. Then we have something like co-management, which is a little bit different, because co-management is a collaboration between government and communities, right, to manage the fisheries. And this is often initiated by government, or it can also be initiated by external interests, right, like NGOs. That has happened quite a lot as well. And co-management is a partnership between states and communities, but it can look very different in different situations. It represents a continuum of approaches. So all the way from, we just consult the community to we actually devolve power to the community to manage the resources, and anything in between. And the rationale, again, for this is that we involve fishing communities in managing resources. We incorporate traditional knowledge. We, again, assist governments to improve compliance, etc. This type of approach can work very well, and it has become sort of the preferred approach for managing small-scale fisheries, but, it can't be used in every situation. It needs investment in training and consultation to work properly. It needs careful structuring and planning. And it's not appropriate for every situation. When you have something like a manufactured community, what I mean by that is it's not an organic community. It's just that you've said, okay, everybody in this area is going to become a community to manage the stocks, or form a cooperative to manage the stocks. It often doesn't work. You need to have people who are used to working together, who have relationships. It also is obviously not going to work for things like highly migratory stocks. And you have to always be careful of elite capture in these situations. Elite capture, of course, being where you provide, for example, fishing rights to a community, and these are all taken by those with power, and those who are more vulnerable don't really get a chance. So, yeah, these are the types of socially driven models that you could also adopt in a fishery. And then finally, we have environmentally driven models, ecosystem-based fisheries management. This is also becoming the gold standard, the best practice for managing fisheries. But in reality, it's pretty difficult to do because it requires you to look at the entire ecosystem, potentially also including the fishes and the communities, because they are part of that fisheries ecosystem. And to try and collect data on all these different elements and try and manage all the interactions between these elements. And, as many of you know, it's hard enough to manage single species sometimes, right? I think in West Africa particularly, trying to get data even on a single species can be challenging, yeah? So, yeah, this type of approach is good, but again, it's difficult to implement. It's very difficult for wealthier countries to implement, and attention, to be honest, continues to be focused on environmental outcomes rather than social outcomes in the system. And then we have something like market-based fisheries management, which it tends to be an attempt by countries to control other countries in reality. So many of you are having to deal with these yellow cards from the EU, right? Yeah. It's a form of control imposed by countries leveraging their much more powerful markets to try and force environmental sustainability in third-party countries. Same with traceability mechanisms like catch documentation schemes. I'm sure some of you have also had to deal with that in relation to the countries like the EU, maybe the US as well. So obviously the rationale for this is to improve environmental outcomes, to protect the markets of those countries. But again, in reality, it's very mixed results in practice, and it often excludes small-scale fisheries from these markets because they just don't have the ability to comply. So, in general, as I said, in many countries, multiple governance mechanisms are used. So you're not just going to adopt one of these. Maybe, for one fishery, it's one approach. For another fishery, it's another approach. And in developing countries, of course, there's the added element of aid and assistance that we have to deal with. So when it comes to the governance system, this complicates things, right? When you have external aid, I mean, it's good, we need it, obviously, from other countries, from external organizations, but, that might come with some strings attached, and, it might set the agenda for a country from that perspective. So, yeah, I mean, it is a complicating mechanism when it comes to the already complex issue of fisheries governance. So speaking of which, let's think about who is actually involved in fisheries governance. And, now we're looking at the governance system holistically at all different spatial scales. So at the international level, of course, we have the UN agencies that, Professor Francis mentioned yesterday, the FAO, the ILO, the IMO, but there's also others, UN Diwalis, and so on. We have other intergovernmental organizations, OECD, WTO. We also have international courts deciding disputes between countries. There have been disputes on fisheries issues. So, at this level, mostly what we're doing is we're negotiating treaties, setting guidelines, things like that, that will then have to be implemented at the national level and the regional level. Then at the regional level, of course, we have RFMOs and regional fisheries bodies. In this region, of course, ICAT, FCWC, SRFC, and then regional economic communities, ECOWAS, EU, etc. And at this level, again, we are, coordinating regional action, but we might also be creating regional agreements, things like that. We also obviously managing the highly migratory and straddling stocks. At the national level, of course, this is where most of you are. We have the government ministries, and as we know, it's not just fisheries, it's also the Navy and the Coast Guard represented here, but also customs, ports, safety, labor, trade, all of these different agencies that need to be working together, but a lot of the time are not. And what often happens is that, one country is collecting data on something that the other, not one country, one organizer, one agency is collecting data on something that another agency needs, but they're not talking to each other, so, there just ends up being duplication of work. So this can be a bit of a problem at the national level because, of course, at the national level, this is where we're implementing all of these international and regional agreements. And then, of course, we have the local level, also extremely important. Fishing communities, fishers, vessel owners, local organizations. This level is extremely important because these are the people who obviously have to comply with all the laws, but also are the ones who are seeing what's happening on the ground and, have very important and valuable information that can be very useful to national governments if you have consultation processes. And then cutting across all of this, of course, we have NGOs. They work at all levels, right? And they do all sorts of different things. So we have very sort of activist militant NGOs like Greenpeace, like Sea Shepherd, that might be out there boarding vessels. And then we have others who are just working on things like policy and such. We have industry and fisheries lobbyists, of course. We can't ignore the fishing industry, and definitely can't ignore the fishing lobbyists because they often hold a lot of power over our processes, right? Then we have academia and research institutes, like many of those represented here, doing research on many different issues, and coordinating bodies that might coordinate, certain of these agencies. I think the Joint Analytical Cell, for instance, coordinates many of these sort of tech NGOs that have created a lot of this monitoring software. So you can see here, obviously, that we are dealing with a lot of different actors at a lot of different spatial scales, right? And what happens here? I mean, what are the problems with this? What are the problems with having so many different actors working on so many different issues at different levels? Anyone want to guess? Yeah.
Lack of cohesion that can lead to conflicts.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. So, we're not talking to each other necessarily, maybe some of us are, but yes, there's complete lack of cohesion, and, it can lead to conflict, 100%, and this can happen at every level. One of the issues that we see a lot of the time is that fisheries management is not necessarily taking into account fishing safety of the fishes, and that can often cause a lot of problems. So, particularly in that area, it's important that we have consultation and collaboration. So just to kind of pull this all together, because we've been talking a lot about fisheries governance and the different components of the system, but just to kind of give you an overview of all the different issues that we need to be thinking about when we are thinking of a fisheries governance system. We have, for example, political arrangements. Now, of course, this is where all the policy is being set, the kind of high-level place where we are negotiating, where we are doing consultation. This is where a lot of people are trying to get their views in, trying to lobby for power because they want to be involved in setting the policy agenda. We also then need to operationalize our policy, and that's, when we get to laws and regulations, which of course are doing all sorts of things. We are, setting out the law, what is legal, what is illegal, what you can do, what you can't do, what happens, if you break the law, giving penalties and enforcement powers to, for example, the Coast Guard, creating dispute resolution mechanisms like courts and so on. And this, of course, is also where we are working to implement all these international and regional agreements that we have become parties to. Then, of course, we have the social element, which you've also talked a lot about, that we obviously forms a very important part of the system. Customary rules and cultural practices. This is also, where we need engagement and consultation, potentially capacity building. This is where we need to think about safety. This is where we need to think about livelihood and so on. And then, of course, the economic aspects, which, we can't ignore absolutely because we want to make profits from our resources. And to do that, we need to think of things like licenses and taxes, markets and trade and value chains. And, can we send our fish overseas? What do we need to do for that? Can we get more money from that? Do we need to fund projects? Do we need to invest in infrastructure? Are we going to provide fishery subsidies? So all of these elements form components of a fisheries governance system, and obviously a fisheries governance system is not just about what's happening in government, it's not just what's happening with the law, it's also what's happening on the ground, what's happening in international markets, and this kind of very, very broad system is sometimes difficult to wrap our heads around, but very important to keep all these elements in mind when we are making decisions on the system. We can't ignore the other elements of the system. And I think that a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next 2 weeks kind of fits into this broader mold, but I just want you to kind of keep this broad system in mind as we go through these more specific aspects and maybe think about how what we're doing is influencing other parts of the system negatively or positively, and how we can address that. So on that note, before we move on to international law, I just want to leave you with a little bit of food for thought. These are not easy questions. These are not questions which I expect you to answer today, but I think they are important issues that we need to think about moving forward, as we work within our fisheries governance systems. So, for example, I have talked a little bit about power dynamics, right? And this is extremely important. So how do power dynamics within fishery systems affect the ability to achieve our governance objectives? If we have fishing lobbyists coming in and lobbying government all the time, to give us more quotas, etc., how does that affect our ability to achieve our environmental goals, for example, our social goals? Which issues are we prioritizing? This is the question I was asking you at the beginning. Think about your fishery system. Which issues does your fishery system prioritize? Is that good or bad? Are we ignoring other elements? How does that interact? Related to this, how do problems like corruption and mismanagement affect our ability to manage our fisheries sector sustainably? Obviously in South Africa, we have extreme corruption. It really affects our ability to govern in many different areas, and fisheries is no exception. When we have people out there legally catching sharks and, paying off the inspectors in the port, how can we achieve any of our goals? Do we actually need to think about how to sort out that governance system before we can even think about implementing new fisheries laws and regulations? Maybe we need to think about how we sort out what we already have, right, and make sure that works efficiently. How do we prevent and resolve conflict? Again, very important. Often what we see is a lack of trust, for example, between fishers and government. How can we build that trust? One issue which we actually do see quite a lot, not necessarily in fisheries, but across many different areas, is this tendency to look at a governance system which is maybe working well in one country and think, can we just adopt that in our country? But, we really need to think about the local context when we do that. For example, in South Africa, not fisheries related, but we went ahead and we adopted the English Company Law Act when we were trying to update our corporations law, our company law. We just took it and shoved it into our law. It didn't make any sense whatsoever because we were built on a different system. We had a mixed legal system. It just completely ignored half of our law. And that can often happen. So we need to be very, very mindful of the local context if we are going to look to other countries for inspiration. It's not like we can't do that, but we need to be mindful of our own context. And then finally, things like marine spatial planning, blue economy. We hear these buzzwords. These are, new ideas that are coming up, right? And how do we fit the kind of already complex governance of fisheries into these broader systems when it's only just one small part of it? All right, so just mull some of those things over as we go through the couple of weeks, and we can always discuss a little bit more. But I think these are really things that we need to just keep in mind as we go forward with our fisheries governance. Does anyone have any questions on international fisheries governance or fisheries governance before I move on to international fisheries law? Nope. Everybody good? Okay, Ivy.
Yeah, I think I just have a little concern about one of the policies or way of regulating fisheries that you mentioned, that some of us have been receiving yellow cards and penalties from bigger countries like developed world, and it's more like a market way of controlling some people. I just want more clarification so that it wouldn't be like, okay, because that statement is made, we could just go ahead and do whatever we like because they're giving us penalties. It's their way of trying to control us. Yeah. I hope my question is clear.
Yeah, I think so. So this is actually something we're going to deal with quite extensively on Friday when we talk about trade, so we can have a longer discussion then. But yeah, I think obviously the short answer is that it's very complicated because, we talked about these power dynamics, and unfortunately a lot of, these bigger countries, because they have these powerful markets, do have a certain amount of power and leverage. There are international mechanisms like the World Trade Organization Court that could potentially rectify this, but, again, this is something where a lot of developing countries don't want to challenge power, and I think this is one of the biggest problems we have. I mean, in governance in general, and also in fisheries governance, that there's fear when it comes to challenging powerful countries. We don't want to lose access to those markets. So yeah, I mean, I think the situation is complicated. There are mechanisms. I'll talk a little bit about that on Friday through the international, the World Trade Organization Court. But again, it comes down very much to things like political will at the end of the day, and the willingness to challenge these systems rather than work within them. So I hope that kind of answers it, yeah.
Yes. Good morning. I just need some clarification on model you mentioned, and I didn't get it so much on customary institution. Can you please elaborate again? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, when we think about customary institutions, these are usually sort of institutions that are created at a community level, within the community, administered often by chiefs and tribal leaders, that put in place certain rules for, fishing. Like you can't fish during certain seasons, certain places, etc. So it kind of is similar to traditional fisheries management in that way. But it is something which is almost developed organically based on traditional knowledge, based on decades and decades of experience in fishing in that area. So that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about customary institutions. And they can work pretty well, like I said. But the difficulty happens when, those dynamics start to change. So these are based on dynamics that have been in place for many, many years. But when those dynamics start to change, like you get population growth, maybe more people wanting to be involved in the fishery, maybe you get modernization of the fishery so you can catch more. And then suddenly those rules don't work so well because they were based on situations that were existing when the population was smaller, the fleet was less motorized. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Bonjour.
Let me get my headphones.
Ok. Bon, par rapport justement aux communautés de pêche, bon, nous au Gabon, nous avons une activité qui est, disons, pratiquement en majorité dirigée par des communautés étrangères. Donc les communautés ghanéennes, par exemple, sénégalaises, ou béninoises, nigérianes également. Et donc, au niveau culturel, souvent les pratiques ne sont pas les mêmes. Il y a comme une espèce d'importation des pratiques. Et donc, il est difficile souvent de coordonner tout cela afin de pouvoir mieux gérer la ressource. Parce qu'il s'agit d'adaptation de certaines personnes. Par exemple, on a des communautés locales qui ont des pratiques qui ne sont pas du tout communes avec celles qui viennent d'ailleurs. Et donc, il est souvent difficile de les faire accepter aux autres. Donc, ma question est de savoir comment est-ce qu'il faut, donc quel type de modèle il faut adapter pour ce genre de cas, par exemple.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. That obviously goes to the gentleman's earlier point on migration, big issue in fishery systems. Yeah, so in that case, obviously, it's a lot more complicated because if your government is obviously letting in those fishers from other countries and it's not illegal, for example, then, you need to find a way to manage that. I think in that case, the government would have to take the lead on that because now you're in a situation where it's very difficult for the communities to work together because now there's very, very different approaches. So perhaps something like co-management, or perhaps you just need to, in that case, adopt maybe a more top-down traditional approach, which is prioritizing environmental sustainability as well as social sustainability, to ensure that you are protecting your own fishes and preventing conflict. And in that case, I think, preventing conflict is going to be a huge part of what you will have to do, because it sounds like there would be a lot of conflict in approaches. But I think it's quite a complicated question. I think it's something that maybe we can discuss more afterwards, and you could give me more detail. Yeah, Raphael, do you want to say something?
J'ai juste une petite question supplémentaire pour nos amis gabonais à propos du cas que vous donnez en disant les pêcheurs étrangers. Moi j'aimerais savoir qui sont ces pêcheurs étrangers. C'est-à-dire, est-ce que ce sont les propriétaires de navires sont gabonais et les propriétaires de navires gabonais importent de la main-d'œuvre du Ghana, du Sénégal parce qu'ils ont des expertises techniques de pêche importantes? Est-ce que ce sont les propriétaires gabonais qui profitent de cette main-d'œuvre étrangère, ou est-ce que ce sont des navires qui ont des permis issus par votre administration maritime et qui sont comment dire, dont les propriétaires sont des Ghanéens, des Sénégalais et qui viennent avec la totalité de leur équipage? Quel est le modèle ici? Parce que c'est très important de voir ce modèle de propriété. Qui est le propriétaire du navire? Qui est le donneur d'ordre par rapport à ça? Pour pouvoir après déterminer quelle est la construction ou la co-construction d'une politique de gestion. Merci.
Je vais m'essayer à une réponse pour dire que culturellement, les communautés gabonaises villageoises ne sont pas, formées ou bien ne pratiquent pas la pêche en mer. C'est vraiment derrière les maisons, dans les eaux continentales, vraiment derrière sa maison, on ses filets. Maintenant, la pêche artisanale, commerciale, là, avec les grands filets de 2 km, culturellement, on ne pratique pas ça. Et donc, le modèle dont vous parlez, ce sont vraiment des communautés étrangères qui viennent avec leur technicité, avec leurs pirogues d'ailleurs, qu'ils fabriquent d'eux-mêmes, avec des dimensions que nous ne maîtrisons pas. Mais à la décharge de mon collègue, quand même, j'aimerais dire qu'effectivement, depuis un certain temps, on s'est engagé dans la nationalisation du secteur. Et dernièrement, d'ailleurs, on a le projet Gapèche. Le gouvernement a offert des pirogues aux jeunes Gabonais volontaires qui iront défier la mer en espérant que ça marche. C'est la méthode qu'on a trouvée. On leur a offert des pirogues, des engins de pêche. Et c'était la semaine dernière, d'ailleurs. On espère que la tendance va s'inverser au fur et à mesure, quoi. Mais c'est des pirogues étrangères par des équipages étrangers qui pratiquent la pêche artisanale maritime au Gabon.
Encore un petit point là-dessus. Est-ce que, parce qu'en fait, il y a quand même une question des permis de pêche. Donc, ça signifie que votre administration, finalement, issue des permis de pêche à ces communautés-là, pour finalement récupérer le poisson pour le bien de la communauté gabonaise. Mais ce ne sont pas des ressortissants gabonais à bord. Donc, si je comprends bien, en fait, votre problématique, c'est comment on peut, d'une pratique de la pêche qui n'était pas existante, de la pêche hauturière qui n'était pas existante dans votre pays, comment, de l'importation d'une main-d'œuvre et d'une technicité, vous pouvez former vos équipages. C'est un petit peu là où se trouve le point.
Raphael, I think perhaps we can have this conversation a bit later, if that's okay, because we still have to get to fisheries law. But I think it's a very interesting conversation about Gabonese fisheries, so I think let's have it later, if that's okay.
Can I add? Can I? Is it okay?
Yeah.
I just want to add something a bit different from our country. Our local community, they normally don't go to either deep sea, exclusive economic zone, not even high seas, because we don't have those bigger vessels to go there. But the government is setting this specific authority to monitor fishery in deep sea. Those foreigners who came, there is regulation and laws, they pay permit, they pay licenses, they pay inspection, observers. So the government is getting something from them, and they just go for EEZ and fish, and they go give us all the report for the catch in our area. So we cannot, as local, we cannot go, but we get benefit by having that situation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for sharing. I think, yeah, that's a potential solution. But let's discuss more afterwards, because it's a very interesting topic. I just don't want to run out of time in talking about international fisheries law. All right, so let's move on. We won't have too much time to talk about all the different laws, but I'm just, again, going to try and give you an overview of the international legal system, you know, how it works, and, you know, how fisheries laws are interacting at international level. So, something very important to understand about the international legal system may seem kind of self-evident, but international law is not the same as national law, right? We have to approach it very differently. International law is decentralized, so we have different regimes. So we have a fisheries regime, labor regime, trade regime, etc., maritime regime, with no overarching unifying framework. So there's no, you know, in general, there isn't a sort of set of principles that all of these regimes kind of adhere to. It's more just that they do their own things. They have certain guidelines, laws, institutions, etc. within that regime. And while it's obviously not completely self-contained, there is a certain element of that. International law is also consensual. So it's very much depending on whether states will abide by it or not, as to whether it really has normative force, and how states actually approach the issue of international law. You know, of course, we have quite a few examples recently of outliers of countries that aren't complying with international law, right? But in general, states will negotiate international laws, comply with international laws, because it provides some benefit for them. They see benefit in working with other states, particularly on transboundary issues like fisheries. So this is why states will enter into international law and hold other states to account. However, of course, we don't really have clear enforcement mechanisms at international law, so it's very difficult to hold states to account if they really don't want to comply. And the laws and institutions are much less developed than legal systems. We don't have any sort of international police force to enforce the law. Now, when it comes to sources of international law, the main one that we probably think about is treaties. Those are, of course, the agreements negotiated between states. Those are binding agreements. We also have this thing called international customary law, which very simplistically just means that law arises from state practice, from the way states behave. Judicial decisions as well. There have been some judicial decisions on fisheries issues. They bind the states that are parties to those cases. And another thing which we see a lot in fisheries is this thing called soft law. So it's not really law because it's voluntary, but it's agreements that states come up with that they're not bound by, but you know, they often actually have a lot of influence, despite the fact that they are voluntary. But this is very common in fisheries law, that we have voluntary agreements rather than binding agreements. So, thinking about the different fisheries instruments, on the binding agreement side, we have things like, of course, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, very comprehensive document, framework for the oceans, often seen as a sort of constitution for the oceans, and has important provisions on fisheries. Particularly, I think, for West African states, one of the most important is the creation of the EEZ, right? Which, you know, allows you to exploit the resources within a 200 nautical mile limit, but also gives you the duty to conserve them. The compliance agreement deals with flag state compliance on the high seas specifically. Flag state compliance is unfortunately one of the big failures of international fisheries law. The United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement, that's the one that deals with, it provides a basis for the creation of regional fisheries management organizations. The Port State Measures Agreement, many of you know, right? Many of you are implementing this agreement. Provides a basis for you to do inspections on IUU fishing in your ports. MARPOL deals with pollution from ships, but that also can include fishing nets. And then the Work and Fishing Convention deals with labor conditions at sea on fishing vessels. The Cape Town Agreement about safety of fishing vessels. STCWF is on manning of fishing vessels. And the Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies, this recent one from the World Trade Organization, is seeking to ban certain types of fisheries subsidies. We're going to be talking about that more on Friday. And then CITES is the one which deals with trade in endangered species. So that's on the binding side. These are kind of all the instruments that are relevant for fisheries that states are bound by. Then we have the non-binding, and as I said, there's quite a lot of them in fisheries, right? These are the soft law. So one of the most important is the FAO Code of Conduct on Responsible Fisheries. This is, in theory, a voluntary instrument, but it's been extremely influential. It's a very comprehensive instrument on the management and governance of fisheries. Covers just about every area. The International Plan of Action on IUU Fishing is specifically dealing with how to address IUU. We also have other soft law instruments that are quite relevant to prevention of IUU fishing, such as the guidelines on catch documentation schemes, the transshipment guidelines, guidelines on flag state performance, and so on. We have small-scale fisheries guidelines as well. And we also have codes of safety and guidelines on construction of small fishing vessels. And then right at the bottom over here, certainly not least, is the Sustainable Development Goals, which, you know, are not actually binding, but of course the 2030 Agenda is something which we are all working towards, particularly in fisheries. So to give you a sort of timeline of when all of these agreements were adopted, you can see in the, I suppose before 1995, we have the much broader framework agreements, you know, UNCLOS, the Compliance Agreement, the FAO Code of Conduct, UMSA, and so on. And then subsequently we get agreements that are a lot more specific. These are agreements that are trying to give effect to different elements of the broader framework conventions. So these are, you know, agreements that are dealing with very specific aspects of fisheries. So subsidies, catch documentation schemes, ports, and so on. Now again, as we talked about earlier, with all those different actors in fisheries governance, and also the fact that in international law we don't really have any overarching unifying framework, we do end up having conflicts sometimes between different regimes when it comes to fisheries law, because all of these different instruments are being created within different regimes. So the trade regime has got the agreement on fisheries subsidies. You know, if we think of fisheries management, that's the FAO instruments. If we think of, you know, safety, that's the IMO. So all these different regimes are creating agreements, and now we have to find a way to harmonize them, because international law is consensual, and countries really, really don't want a situation where they have negotiated for 20 years to get an agreement, and then you say to them, no, this agreement is now null and void because this later agreement came along which cancels it out. So we really don't want that. Countries don't want that. So what we try and do is we try and harmonize this framework so it can all work together. So some of these agreements have a direct relationship. The United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement is an implementing, it's related to UNCLOS. It's related to UNCLOS. It gives effect to provisions on straddling and highly migratory stocks. Of course, the FAO instruments, you know, are all related as well. And there's other agreements that sometimes include clauses to avoid this fragmentation that can happen. So the FAO Code of Conduct, for example, says that nothing in this agreement shall be interpreted to conflict with the World Trade Organization agreements. So that's another way to do it. And then one thing that many of these laws have done is they've adopted the same definition of IUU fishing. So the definition of IUU fishing Medina actually mentioned it in her presentation yesterday, comes from the International Plan of Action on IUU fishing. I don't particularly like this definition. I think it has a lot of problems, but nevertheless, this is the definition that has been adopted in the Port State Measures Agreement, in the Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies, in RFMO documents, and so on. So this is just one way that we seek to harmonize the system. And we also have a certain amount of interaction between secretariats, for example, of different agreements. Also, sometimes agreements are adopted in light of failures of other agreements. So, like I mentioned earlier, flag state control in fisheries is pretty poor. We have these flags of convenience, flags of non-compliance that that allow allow any vessels to flag to them, and then don't necessarily control them too well. And this has been a real failure when it comes to managing fisheries, control of fisheries, particularly fisheries on the high seas or fisheries that are going to waters of other countries, right? And so this is part of the reason the PSMA was adopted, to actually counteract some of those failures. Now, it's not a perfect solution, obviously, because not all vessels are going into foreign ports after they catch fish, but nevertheless, sometimes it happens that we just see that international agreements don't have the same uptake that we would want them to, and we try and think of other ways around them. So we don't have too much time. I'm not going to go over all of these agreements separately, but I have included notes on all of these on the slides, so you can go and take a look at them later, and I'm very happy to discuss with you some more, but obviously I'm not going to be able to go over all of the many instruments. But just to quickly talk about UNCLOS. UNCLOS, as I said, is the the agreement that allows for the creation of exclusive economic zones. It also promotes the optimum utilization of resources, which means that it promotes the use of access agreements, so agreements between distant water fishing nations and coastal states, when a state is not able to fully fish its own resources. So this is the agreement that provides the basis for the access agreements that your countries have with the EU, with China, with Korea, and others. Like I said, the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries is a voluntary instrument, but extremely influential, and it's extremely comprehensive as well. It covers everything: economic, environmental, social principles, enforcement principles, regulatory principles. If you are working in fisheries, if you are thinking about the fisheries governance system, I would really encourage you to take a look at this instrument. United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement, we've already talked about. The compliance agreement, we've already talked about. All right. So very briefly, let's talk about the legal framework for IUU fishing. There's three main instruments I just want to highlight for you that are very relevant when you are addressing the issue of IUU from a legal perspective. The first one is this International Plan of Action on IUU fishing that I spoke about, which has the definition of IUU fishing. Again, very comprehensive instrument, very important if you're trying to tackle IUU fishing. It deals with all the different elements of IUU fishing. And again, like fisheries governance, IUU fishing is something where you cannot just work in one little area, in one sector in isolation. You really need to be looking at the problem holistically if you want to solve it. This is the definition of IUU, which Medina showed you yesterday. The reason that I don't think it's a great definition is because it's just too much in one, right? We have illegal fishing up here, which of course, that's pretty straightforward. That's contravention of fisheries law, right? Pretty easy. Unreported fishing, contravention of fisheries law dealing with catch reporting, yeah? But then we have this unregulated fishing, which is a bit strange, right? So it has two parts to it. One is fishing in an RFMO area by vessels that are stateless or from countries that are not members of the RFMO. Okay, fine. You could also say that it's, in a way addressing illegality. But then it has this provision on fishing in waters where there are no applicable conservation or management measures in a manner that contravenes a state's international obligations. Now, what is the issue with that, right? Lumping it in with illegal and unreported. There's no laws here, yeah? So if I'm engaging in unregulated fishing as a fisher, and there's no law telling me what I can and can't do, you know, why am I at fault? I guess is the question. I'm at fault if I'm engaging in illegal fishing, but in unregulated fishing, there's no law. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to include it in here, and the effect of this is that when people see IUU fishing, they think illegal fishing. And then when you are trying to address IUU fishing, particularly in response to something like an EU yellow card, right? Then you think, okay, well, I can also deal with unregulated fishing, and who am I going to target then? Who is most likely to be unregulated? It's the small-scale fisheries, right? Because they're much harder to regulate than the industrial fisheries. So often small-scale fisheries become a target for reform because of this definition. So for me, this definition is too broad and really needs to be broken into its component parts. And I think this is the kind of overarching trend in academia, that we feel like it needs to be broken into its component parts and not all lumped together. So quickly to show you the contents of the IPOA IUU, you can see it's very comprehensive. It's dealing with legalities, MCS, traceability, cooperation, RFMOs, trade, you know, everything you can think of when it comes to addressing IUU fishing. I think you all know how the Port State Measures Agreement works, right? I don't need to go into too much detail. Foreign vessels request entry. You either say no, because I think you're involved in IUU and you deny port, or you inspect them. And if you find IUU fishing, then you can deny port. You can also take any other measure in conformity with international law. So a lot of people think that the Port State Measures Agreement is just about denying port. It's not. You can also take other measures as well. You can impose fines. You can confiscate catch, things like that. And then, of course, you have to inform when you deny port the flag state, relevant coastal states, RFMOs, and other international organizations if relevant. And then finally, we have these new transshipment guidelines from the FAO. They just provide kind of a basis if you want to regulate transshipment in your waters. Transshipment is a really problematic element when it comes to IUU. It's often how illicit fish trade is conducted when you're transshipping at sea. This can also facilitate forced labor if you're transshipping people. So it's really important to regulate it, but transshipment is very poorly regulated globally. So these guidelines just provide minimum standards for states that want to regulate transshipment in their waters. All right, so I know that was a little bit of a quick overview of the international legal system. Like I said, these agreements, more details available on the slides, and I'm happy to discuss further. But I just want to leave you with some final food for thought, and this is going to be something which we talk about in our focus groups today, so we can start thinking about it now. And that is looking at this international fisheries framework and thinking about everything that it entails and everything it requires from states. How can we incorporate this international fisheries law, which, let's face it, I mean, the negotiations are often being driven by wealthier developed countries that have the money to go and send delegations to negotiate in Europe, wherever this is happening. How can we incorporate this into our regional and national systems in a way that is feasible so we can actually implement it, that's fair to us, and also contextually appropriate? And maybe we need to think about alternatives. Maybe we need to think about our regional bodies engaging in thinking about creating agreements that are based on these international agreements, but maybe better for us, better for our countries. I don't think we have time for questions, but I'm happy to discuss anything within the coffee breaks or within the next 2 weeks. But thank you so much.